When I first set foot in Willow Creek Estates, it felt like stepping into a dream. The gated community was everything I'd hoped for, a peaceful retreat surrounded by lush greenery and endless possibilities. For years, I'd dreamed of having my own piece of land where I could grow fresh, organic produce, not just for myself, but to share with the local community. It wasn't about money, it was about passion. So when I finally bought a 2-acre plot in this upscale neighborhood, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. The first few weeks were magical. I spent hours planning my garden, sketching out rows of heirloom tomatoes, vibrant kale, juicy strawberries, and zucchini plants. Every seed I planted felt like a promise, a small step towards something meaningful. As the days passed, tiny sprouts began to emerge from the soil, and I couldn't help but feel proud. This was my sanctuary, my little corner of the world where I could create something beautiful. But not everyone shared my excitement. Almost as soon as my crops started thriving, letters began arriving at my doorstep. They came from the Homeowners Association, or HOA, as everyone called them. At first, they seemed harmless enough. A polite note reminding me that my tomato stakes were unsightly and needed to be replaced with something more aesthetically pleasing. Then another one complaining that my irrigation hoses were visible from the street. Each letter carried the same tone, firm but friendly, as if they were doing me a favor by pointing out these so-called flaws. I tried not to let it bother me. After all, I had bigger things to focus on than whether my hoses matched the color scheme of the neighborhood. I figured if I ignored them, they'd eventually leave me alone. But the letters kept coming, each one more detailed than the last. One even suggested I remove an entire row of kale because it was disrupting the visual harmony of the area. Visual harmony. Really? My kale? Still, I told myself to stay calm. Maybe they didn't understand what I was trying to do here. Perhaps they saw my garden as messy or unkempt, rather than the labor of love it truly was. I decided to take matters into my own hands and invited a couple of neighbors over to explain my vision. Over lemonade and cookies, I showed them how much care went into maintaining the garden. To my relief, they seemed genuinely interested. One neighbor even complimented my strawberries, saying she'd never seen such healthy-looking fruit before. But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear that not everyone was won over. Some neighbors smiled politely but avoided eye contact whenever I brought up the garden. Others whispered behind my back, their disapproval evident in the way they glanced at my property. And then there were the HOA members themselves, always watching, always judging. Their letters grew harsher, less forgiving. It was no longer just about aesthetics. Now, they accused me of violating rules I hadn't even known existed. Despite the growing tension, I refused to give up. I poured every ounce of energy into nurturing my crops, determined to prove that beauty and functionality could coexist. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was brewing beneath the surface, something I wasn't ready for. Little did I know, the worst was yet to come, and it would change everything I thought I knew about Willow Creek Estates. The morning it happened, I woke up with a sense of unease. Something felt off, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The air was unusually still, and the birds that normally chirped outside my window were silent. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe the weather had something to do with it. But as I stepped out onto my porch, coffee in hand, the sight before me stopped me cold. My garden, my pride and joy, was gone. Not just wilting or struggling, but completely destroyed. Every single plant lay lifeless, their once vibrant leaves now yellowed and brittle. The stems snapped under the slightest touch, and the fruits hung shriveled, like ghosts of what they used to be. It looked like a scene from a disaster movie. Except this wasn't fiction. This was real, and it was my reality. Panic surged through me as I rushed down to inspect the damage up close. My mind raced with questions. What could have caused this? Had there been a freak storm overnight? Was it some kind of pest infestation? But deep down, I already knew the truth. This wasn't natural. Someone, or something, had done this on purpose. I called Mike, an old friend who worked in agriculture, hoping he might have answers. He arrived within the hour, his face grim as he surveyed the wreckage. Without saying a word, he knelt down, plucked a leaf, and sniffed it carefully. Then he pulled out a small testing kit from his bag. After a few minutes of analysis, he turned to me, his expression confirming my worst fears. "It's herbicide," he said flatly. "Someone sprayed chemicals all over your crops. And judging by the extent of the damage, they didn't hold back. Herbicide." The word hit me like a punch to the gut. How could anyone do this? These plants weren't just things. They represented months of hard work, late nights, early mornings, and countless sacrifices. They were supposed to feed people, bring joy, and make a difference. Now, they were nothing more than waste. Mike tried to reassure me, explaining that we could file a report with the authorities and maybe even track down whoever was responsible. But as he spoke, I couldn't help but think about the HOA. Their constant criticism, their relentless nitpicking. It all seemed too coincidental. Could they really have stooped this low? Would they actually destroy $53,000 worth of crops over complaints about stakes and hoses? Determined to get answers, I called the police. 2 officers showed up later that afternoon, taking notes and snapping photos of the carnage. They promised to investigate but warned me that cases like this were tricky. Without solid evidence, it would be nearly impossible to pin the blame on anyone. Frustration bubbled inside me. How was I supposed to fight back against something so calculated, so cruel? That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat on my porch staring at the ruins of my garden. Tears streamed down my face, not just from anger, but from sheer exhaustion. For weeks, I'd been fighting a losing battle against rules and regulations that made no sense. Now this, it felt like the universe itself was conspiring against me. But then, amidst the despair, a spark of defiance ignited. If someone thought they could silence me, they were wrong. This wasn't just about my garden anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. Whoever had done this wanted to break me, but they'd only made me stronger. And I vowed, right then and there, that I wouldn't let them win. As night fell, I began drafting letters, gathering evidence, and reaching out to neighbors who might support me. I didn't know where this journey would lead, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going down without a fight. The days following the destruction of my garden were a blur of emotions. Anger, sadness, and frustration swirled inside me. But beneath it all was a growing determination to uncover the truth. I couldn't just sit back and let this slide, not after everything I'd poured into that land. So while the police continued their investigation, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I started by talking to my neighbors, hoping someone might have seen or heard something unusual the night my crops were poisoned. At first, people were hesitant to speak up. Some avoided eye contact altogether, while others offered vague condolences without really engaging. But as I knocked on more doors and shared my story, cracks began to form in the wall of silence. One neighbor, Mrs. Carter, finally opened up. She lived 2 houses down and often walked her dog past my property. She admitted she'd noticed a strange car parked near my garden late one evening earlier that week. It was dark blue, maybe black, she said thoughtfully, and there were 2 people inside. They didn't look like they belonged here. Her words sent a chill down my spine. 2 people. A strange car. It sounded deliberate, calculated, but who would go to such lengths to destroy a garden? And why? Another breakthrough came when Greg, a younger resident who lived across the street, approached me after seeing me talk to Mrs. Carter. He seemed nervous, glancing over his shoulder as if afraid someone might overhear us. "Look, I don't want to cause trouble," he began, "but you should know, the HOA has been holding secret meetings lately. I accidentally walked in on one last month. They were talking about your garden and how it was ruining the neighborhood's image." His revelation confirmed what I'd suspected all along. The HOA wasn't just annoyed with me. They saw me as a threat. My thriving crops stood out against their rigid rules and cookie-cutter lawns, challenging their idea of perfection. And instead of finding a way to compromise, they chose destruction. Armed with these clues, I dug deeper. I requested copies of recent HOA meeting minutes under the guise of wanting to stay informed as a homeowner. To my surprise, they handed them over without hesitation, perhaps because they didn't realize what I was looking for. Buried in the dry language of budgets and landscaping guidelines was a single line that caught my attention. Asterisk discussion regarding enforcement measures concerning non-compliant properties. Asterisk enforcement measures. The phrase felt ominous, especially given everything that had happened. Then, one rainy afternoon, I stumbled upon something even bigger. While cleaning out my garage, I found an old folder labeled asterisk community guidelines and policies asterisk. Flipping through it, I discovered a section detailing penalties for violations, including fines, warnings, and something called corrective action. The wording was vague, but it left room for interpretation. Could corrective action include spraying herbicide on someone's plants? As pieces of the puzzle fell into place, I realized I needed help beyond my own efforts. I reached out to a local journalist named Lisa, whose articles about community issues had always struck a chord with me. Over coffee, I told her my story, the garden, the letters, the poisoning, and the evidence I'd gathered so far. Her eyes widened as I spoke, and by the time I finished, she was already jotting down notes furiously. "This is huge," she said. "If we can prove the HOA is behind this, it'll blow the lid off everything." Her enthusiasm gave me hope, but it also reminded me of the stakes. Going public meant putting myself, and my family, in the spotlight. It meant facing backlash from powerful people who wouldn't hesitate to retaliate. Still, I knew I couldn't back down. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about standing up for anyone who'd ever felt powerless against unfair systems. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I replayed the events in my mind. From the moment I planted those first seeds to the devastation of my crops, every step had led me here, to a crossroads where fear met courage. Whatever happened next, I vowed to keep fighting. Because sometimes, the hardest battles lead to the most meaningful victories. The article hit the local newspaper's front page 2 days later, and it spread like wildfire. Lisa had done an incredible job piecing together my story, weaving in quotes from neighbors who'd witnessed the HOA's growing hostility. The headline read, "Asterisk homeowner's dream garden destroyed. Was it vandalism or HOA retaliation?" Asterisk within hours, my phone was buzzing nonstop. Calls from reporters, messages of support from strangers, and even emails from other homeowners across the country sharing their own horror stories about HOAs gone rogue. At first, the attention felt overwhelming. I hadn't expected the story to blow up so quickly, and the thought of being thrust into the spotlight terrified me. But as more people reached out, something shifted inside me. Their words reminded me that I wasn't alone. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was part of a much larger conversation about fairness, accountability, and justice. Meanwhile, the HOA scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. Mrs. Henderson, the president of the board, issued a formal statement denying any involvement in the herbicide incident. "We are deeply saddened by what has happened to our neighbor's garden," she wrote, her tone polished and rehearsed. "However, we strongly condemn vandalism of any kind and assure residents that the HOA is not responsible for these actions." Her words might have sounded convincing to some, but they rang hollow to me, and to many others. Neighbors began whispering among themselves, questioning how much the HOA really knew. Karen, the woman who lived next door and had always been quick to criticize my garden, suddenly avoided making eye contact whenever I passed her driveway. Even Greg, who'd shared his concerns with me earlier, admitted he'd overheard heated arguments at recent HOA meetings about damage control. But the real turning point came when Lisa uncovered a bombshell. While reviewing public records related to the HOA, She stumbled upon receipts showing purchases made by the organization, including one for industrial-grade herbicide just weeks before my crops were destroyed. The timing was too coincidental to ignore. When Lisa confronted the HOA about the receipts, they initially dismissed them as routine maintenance expenses. But under mounting pressure, cracks began to show. One board member resigned abruptly, citing personal reasons. Another refused to comment altogether. Behind closed doors, tensions within the HOA were boiling over, and their once unified front started crumbling. Back in my corner of Willow Creek Estates, the community dynamic shifted dramatically. Neighbors who'd previously kept their distance now approached me with stories of their own frustrations. Sarah, a young mother of two, confided that she'd been fined repeatedly for letting her kids play outside because their toys cluttered the yard. Mr. Patel, a retired engineer, revealed he'd been forced to remove solar panels from his roof after the HOA deemed them unsightly. Each story added fuel to the fire, strengthening my resolve to push for change. With Lisa's help, I organized a meeting at the community center to discuss the situation openly. Dozens of residents showed up, filling the room with voices eager to be heard. For the first time, people spoke candidly about the fear and intimidation tactics used by the HOA. Some shared photos of excessive fines. Others recounted instances where complaints led to retaliation. It was cathartic and empowering to see everyone come together. By the end of the meeting, we'd formed a coalition dedicated to holding the HOA accountable. We drafted petitions demanding transparency, circulated flyers encouraging residents to attend upcoming board meetings, and even contacted a lawyer specializing in property disputes. Slowly but surely, the power dynamic in Willow Creek Estates began to shift. Still, challenges lay ahead. The HOA wasn't going down without a fight, and neither were its staunchest supporters. Rumors spread about lawsuits and counter-lawsuits, and tensions ran high. But despite the uncertainty, one thing was clear: the silence had been broken. And once you let light into darkness, there's no putting it back. For me, this wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about creating a community where everyone could thrive, free from fear and oppression. Whatever came next, I knew we were ready to face it together. As the battle against the HOA intensified, I found myself at the center of a storm that was growing bigger by the day. The coalition we'd formed wasn't just about me anymore. It had become a movement fueled by shared anger and frustration. Neighbors who once avoided each other now exchanged knowing looks during morning walks. Conversations at the community mailbox turned into strategy sessions. Willow Creek Estates, once a picture of quiet conformity, was buzzing with rebellion. The HOA tried to regain control, issuing statements and holding emergency meetings to address resident concerns. But no one was buying it. Their polished words felt empty compared to the raw emotions pouring out of our neighborhood. At one particularly heated meeting, Sarah stood up and confronted Mrs. Henderson directly. "Why should we trust you?" she demanded, her voice trembling but firm. "You've bullied us for years, fined us for nothing. And now this. How can you even look us in the eye?" Mrs. Henderson stammered, clearly unprepared for such open defiance. For the first time, cracks appeared in her carefully constructed facade. She tried to deflect, blaming vague outside influences for the discord, but the room erupted in murmurs of disbelief. People weren't falling for her excuses anymore. Meanwhile, Lisa's investigation uncovered even more damning evidence. Emails obtained through public records requests revealed internal discussions among HOA members about how to handle problematic homeowners. One email chain specifically mentioned my garden, with phrases like *teaching a lesson* and *sending a message. Another referenced the herbicide purchase, casually noting that it would take care of the issue quickly. When these emails were made public, outrage swept through the community. Even some longtime supporters of the HOA began questioning their loyalty. A few board members resigned, citing personal reasons, while others distanced themselves publicly, claiming they hadn't been involved in decision-making. The organization that had once wielded so much power was unraveling before our eyes. But as satisfying as it was to see them falter, the fight took its toll on all of us. Late-night meetings left me exhausted, and the constant tension weighed heavily on my family. Mark worried about retaliation, reminding me to lock our doors and keep an eye out for anything suspicious. Still, there was no turning back now. Every setback only strengthened my resolve. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset, Greg approached hesitantly. He carried a stack of papers under his arm and looked nervous, glancing around as if afraid someone might see him. "I thought you should know," he said quietly, handing me the documents. They were copies of private messages between key HOA members discussing plans to intimidate residents who spoke out. My name appeared multiple times, along with threats of legal action if I didn't back down. Greg's bravery moved me deeply. By sharing this information, he risked alienating himself from people he'd known for years. Yet here he was, standing beside me when it mattered most. It reminded me why I'd started fighting in the first place, not just for myself, but for everyone who deserved better. With this new evidence, we filed a formal complaint with local authorities, demanding an independent investigation into the HOA's activities. Lawyers joined the fray, offering pro bono services to help hold them accountable. Reporters camped outside the gates of Willow Creek Estates, eager to capture every twist and turn of the unfolding drama. Through it all, I held on to hope, not just for justice, but for change. This wasn't just about punishing those responsible. It was about creating a future where fear didn't dictate how we lived. As winter approached and frost dusted the ground where my garden used to thrive, I planted a single seed in my heart: the belief that something beautiful could grow from ashes. Whatever happened next, I knew we were laying the foundation for a brighter tomorrow. The final showdown came on a cold January evening, inside the same sterile community center where so many tense meetings had taken place before. But this time was different. The room buzzed with energy, packed to capacity as residents filed in. Some clutching binders filled with evidence, others whispering nervously about what might happen next. Even the air seemed charged, heavy with anticipation. This wasn't just another HOA meeting. It was Judgment Day. Mrs. Henderson sat at the front table, flanked by two remaining board members who looked pale and uneasy. Gone was her usual air of authority. Instead, she fidgeted with her pen, avoiding eye contact with the crowd. Behind her, a whiteboard displayed an agenda that no one paid attention to. Everyone knew why we were really here: accountability. When the meeting began, Mrs. Henderson attempted to maintain control, calling for order and reminding everyone of respectful dialogue. Her voice wavered, betraying nerves she couldn't hide. Almost immediately, hands shot up across the room, each person eager to speak their truth. Sarah went first, recounting how fines had forced her family to choose between fixing their car or paying the HOA. Mr. Peddle followed, explaining how he'd been shamed into removing solar panels, despite promises they'd increased property value over time. Then it was my turn. Standing up, I felt a mix of fear and determination coursing through me. Holding up the stack of documents Gray had risked everything to share, I laid out the timeline: the escalating complaints, the herbicide purchase, the emails plotting retaliation. "This isn't about gardens or rules," I said, my voice steady now. "It's about power, and what happens when people abuse it." The room erupted in murmurs, then applause. For the first time, the HOA's carefully constructed image crumbled completely. One former board member broke down in tears, admitting she'd gone along with decisions she didn't agree with because she feared backlash. Another confessed to signing off on the herbicide order without fully understanding its purpose. By the end of the night, there was no denying the truth. The HOA had overstepped in ways none of us could have imagined. But justice didn't stop there. In the weeks that followed, authorities launched an official investigation into the HOA's practices. Several members faced criminal charges for their roles in the poisoning and other unethical actions. Lawsuits piled up, draining the organization's funds and leaving them unable to enforce even basic rules. Local lawmakers introduced new regulations aimed at preventing similar abuses elsewhere, inspired by our fight. For Willow Creek Estates, life slowly began to change. Neighbors started repairing fences, not just physical ones, but emotional barriers too. People smiled more, waved hello, and actually stopped to chat instead of rushing past each other. Gardens reappeared in yards, colorful and vibrant, defying old restrictions. Kids played outside again, their laughter echoing through streets once ruled by silence. Yet scars remained. Trust takes years to rebuild, and not everyone stayed. Some families moved away, tired of the drama. Others, like Karen, kept quiet, watching from the sidelines as the neighborhood transformed around them. Still, progress was undeniable. Where fear and division had once thrived, unity and resilience now took root. As spring approached, I decided to replant my garden, not just for myself, but as a symbol of hope. Friends and neighbors joined me, bringing seeds and tools, eager to help. Together, we tilled the soil, planted rows of vegetables, and dreamed of brighter days ahead. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever is, but it was ours. And that made all the difference. Looking back, I realized something important. Sometimes, the hardest battles lead to the most meaningful victories. This fight hadn't just saved my garden. It had saved us all. Years later, driving past Willow Creek Estates feels surreal. The gates still stand tall, but the atmosphere has transformed entirely. Where once there was tension and fear, now there's warmth and connection. Gardens burst with color, roses climb trellises, vegetable patches thrive, and children play freely on sidewalks lined with chalk drawings. It's a place reborn, shaped by resilience and courage. Every so often, I'm invited back to speak at community events or meet newly elected HOA leaders who are determined to do things differently. These new faces are worlds apart from the old guard. They're approachable, open-minded, and genuinely invested in making the neighborhood better for everyone. They've introduced policies that prioritize transparency, fairness, and collaboration. Residents have a real voice now, and decisions are made collectively rather than imposed from above. During one such visit, I stood on the same stage where we confronted Mrs. Henderson all those years ago. This time, though, the room was filled with smiles instead of scowls. As I shared my story, the poisoned crops, the fight for justice, the eventual victory, I could see nods of understanding among the audience. Some wiped away tears, others clapped enthusiastically when I finished. What struck me most was how many people said they felt inspired to stand up for themselves, not just in their communities, but in other areas of life too. Back home, I often reflect on everything that happened. Losing my garden was devastating, yes, but it taught me lessons I never would have learned otherwise. I discovered the power of unity, the importance of speaking out, and the strength that comes from standing firm in your beliefs, even when the odds seem insurmountable. And perhaps most importantly, I learned that change is possible if you're willing to fight for it. Today, my own garden is thriving again. Rows of heirloom tomatoes stretch toward the sky, strawberries glisten under the sun, and kale leaves sway gently in the breeze. But this time, it's not just mine. It belongs to everyone who helped bring it back to life. Neighbors stop by regularly to pick fresh produce or lend a hand with planting. Kids laugh as they dig in the dirt, learning about seeds and growth. It's become more than a garden. It's a symbol of what we built together. The scars of the past haven't disappeared completely. Sometimes I catch glimpses of them in subtle ways. A neighbor avoiding eye contact, an awkward silence during conversations about the old days. Healing takes time, and while forgiveness isn't always easy, it's necessary. We've chosen to focus on moving forward rather than dwelling on pain. After all, holding on to bitterness only keeps us stuck in the past, and none of us want to go back there. When people ask me if it was worth it, all the stress, sleepless nights, and emotional turmoil, I don't hesitate to say yes. Not because I came out victorious, but because the journey changed me. and my community for the better. Those dark days forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, control, and human nature. And in doing so, they showed us the kind of world we wanted to create, one rooted in kindness, respect, and equality. As I sit on my porch watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, I feel a deep sense of gratitude. For every challenge, there's been a lesson. For every loss, a gain. And for every act of cruelty, an opportunity to choose compassion instead. Life will always throw curveballs, but I know now that we're stronger together, and sometimes the hardest battles lead to the sweetest victories. Because in the end, it's not about the gardens, the rules, or even the HOA. It's about the people, the hearts and hands that come together to build something lasting. And that's a legacy worth fighting for.